Today, we are going to introduce you to ICD-10-PCS. Now, you've heard me already mention it in the previous lectures. I absolutely love PCS. It is so much easier to use than CPT, actually, if you have exposure to CPT. ICD-10-PCS is used for inpatient procedure codes, and it's nothing like you've ever experienced in coding before. It's multi-axial, so it can shoot off in any direction with the change of a character. So let's talk about it in the aspect of what the manual looks like. So if you have your PCS manual, go ahead and pull that out, get your notebook ready to make notes so that as we go along, if something comes up you want to come back and reference, then that would be a good time to jot it down. PCS is, again, not like CPT or ICD-10 or HCPCS. Even the alphabetic index is different. It's kind of divided up into two sections. And then you have, instead of a tabular, the rest of the manual that would be like the tabular is actually PCS tables. And in a table, it allows you to get the first three characters, and then you just look at a drop down. You pick what goes next, and then there's a drop down of applicable higher specificities. Okay, and if it's not in the drop down, then you don't have the right code. You have to back up and start over. The manual itself is relatively easy to use once you start using it, but I'll tell you right up front, to be really good at PCS, you've got to know the root operations. Now, there's around 31 root operations, and that's the third character in the setup of a PCS code. And once you know those root operations, everything else literally falls into place. So you know, it's really easy to pick your first two characters, and then the third character is the root operations, and the verbiage is different. The terminology is a little bit different than what maybe you're used to. Like a removal for a root operation is you can't remove an appendix. It's would be like an amputations. Removals are always amputations. So you can remove the leg below the knee, but you don't remove your appendix, even though that sounds like what you would do. And again, once you understand the root operations, then it's just literally like filling in the blank to build the rest of the code. Super easy to use. The approach is a little bit different. You'll look up in the index to get you started. There's some common codes, common procedures, and then you're going to be able to look up terms as well, like you do in ICD-CPT. When we first started looking at PCS was actually done back in the early 90s, and we've had volume 3 of ICD-9. So if you've been coding long enough that you remember ICD-9, volume 3 in your ICD manual was the procedure codes that you use for inpatient. But then they were running out of codes because it was only 4 characters. You'd have your two digits, a decimal, and 2 more digits, and there just wasn't the ability to cover everything. It was extremely limited, and the verbiage wasn't that good. It had a lot of limitations. So 3M invented or developed ICD-10-PCS, and it was fabulous. It continues to grow. They started using it in actually 96, but nobody really talked about it. Not many people realized back then. General mainstream coders, we didn't talk about it or use it. Well, when we switched to ICD-10 from ICD-9, that's when they said, hey, it's time to now use ICD-10-PCS for inpatient procedures. Nobody else internationally uses PCS. Now, everybody else predominantly uses ICD-10 for their diagnosis codes. We use ICD-10-CM, which has clinical modifications. Canada uses ICD-10, I think CA. Finland uses ICD-10, I think it's FN. South Africa does, Australia, everybody, all the major countries internationally, they use a form of ICD-10. We didn't start using it until 2015 and 16, but PCS is exclusive to the US, right? So nobody else is going to recognize that internationally. There are 4 things that makes ICD-10-PCS unique in its ability to be expandable and be able to get to a higher specificity. So those 4 things is completeness, expandability, multi-axial, and standardized terminology. Let's talk about those a little bit. Well, let me go back. I thought I had another slide to explain it, but I guess I don't. So with the completeness, we were really limited with volume 3 of ICD-9. We can tell so much more of the story in a procedure with the characteristics of PCS. And that is because one is it's expandable. With volume 3, like we said, we only had four characters, 4 digits, not even characters. There was no numbers involved. And after a certain amount of time, you just run out of characters. Plus, it's multi-axial. So when I talked about that, there's a couple ways I've used to explain it. One, I've used examples of a block. Those little wooden blocks you had as a child, and you start out with 1 block. There's, like 7 blocks, and then you can just flip the block to make it be whatever you want. So if you wanted to do ABC, then you would put, an A, and then the next one you'd turn until you found the B and the C, but even they were limited to just the sides, right? Well, then I explained it like a train track. So you have your engine, and then you have more information as you put each car on your train, but it's more, I think, like a wagon wheel. So you have, when they say multi-axial, so you have your main term. So let's say we're going to be working in med surge, which would be an O, and then it breaks off, and then it breaks off again and gives you choices. So the first 3 characters are like the spokes on a wagon wheel, but after that, it's more like a tree. Okay, so you can pick and then break off from that branch, right? So there's a lot of ways to explain it. Whatever works best for you, once we get to play with it and you start using it, then you may have an analogy that share with us in the Student Support Hub or in the club what this makes you think of. The standardized terminology also is extremely beneficial because when something is standard, it's limited. Okay, think of English, for example. Our language is based somewhat off of Latin, especially in the medical field, right? So there are certain words that you would recognize if it was said in Spanish or if it was said in English, because the root word is the same. We just either pronounce it different or we change it a little bit, but you still know what we are saying, right? You can make it out because the words are similar. But even with the English that they speak in the UK, we have different words that we use for things like, an elevator is an elevator for us, but a lift for them, and a flashlight's a torch, and the trunk of their car is a boot, and there's just little things that we say that's different. And so it's not a standard terminology, right? Whereas root words are very standard and they only mean one thing. That's the way that the root operations work in PCS. And so once you learn those root operations, everything falls in that. It's either it does or it doesn't, okay? Like removal only applies to amputations. Well, that means that if you see an amputation, you know it's under the root word removal. You don't have to look anywhere else. There's no guesswork because you know that's the standard. And that's something you'll learn to appreciate. The tabular and the index, again, is different than CM. I already mentioned that. The index is divided up with common procedures, and then you can look them up with more of word lookup, just like we do with the alphabetic index with our ICD-10, but there is no tabular. It's tables after that. However, the top, just like if you're looking up a word in a dictionary, the tables work the same way. So you'll be able to look at the top and be able to make out what you're wanting to find for your code. The alphabetic index is going to only cover the first 3 or 4 characters of your multiple character PCS code. So the first 3 characters or the first 4 characters will be given to you. Then you go to that, you find that table, and then you can just go down the drop down in the table and fill in the blank. Now, there are some exceptions where you'll see the entire code listed in the index, but again, that's rare, and it ends up being very commonly used codes. All of your characters, they are going to be either numbers or letters. That's why we call them characters. Whereas like with ICD-10, you're going to have a letter at the beginning, and you could have a letter at the end, but very seldom are you going to have, after that, it's numbers in the middle. There is no decimal with PCS. Okay, so there's no limit to the way that your table or your block can turn, and each character is very specific to one thing. Each placement is always going to represent one thing. So the very first placement is going to let us know what area we're working in. Are we working in obstetrics, or are we working in med-surg? And the largest of all of them is med-surg. They are alphanumeric, okay, but we use them, we call them characters, but they actually are classified as value. That's what their real name is. There's 34 possible values for each character. So we've got numbers 0 through 9, okay, because it's one block at a time. You would never have an 11 or a 10. So it's just 0 through 9. Then your letters are going to be A through H, J through N, and P through Z, but we don't use I and O. Okay, those are not used right now. But that gives us 2 characters that haven't even been used yet for expandability. So that's kind of awesome, isn't it? In your alphabetic index, there is 2 main terms, 2 ways to look up the first 3 or 4 characters. It's either going to be a root operation or a general type of procedure. So with a root operation, if we're going to do an amputation, a BKA, a below the knee amputation, then we're going to look under removal, because that only deals with amputations. And then again, there's some common procedures that are just so common that they went ahead and put them in the index. You're not going to find acronyms or eponyms, like you would see in ICD-10-CM. 7-character possibility. And in my opinion, the most pivotal character is going to be that 3rd one. That's the one that's going to have the largest learning curve, but once you get it, everything else falls into place. Med-surg is the largest area, and that's your first character. So you're going to predominantly be in med-surg, and med-surg starts with a 0. Now that is not the letter O, that is a 0. So when you first started ICD-10, when I started teaching ICD-10, I told my students that it would be a good time to start learning to do a strike through if you handwrite zeros versus the letter O. that's because you could have codes like zoo, ZOO.00, and it just becomes a good habit. If you have obstetric codes, they're going to be the letter O, and then you could have an O after that, and it's easier for the eye to distinguish that. But it's even more so, you want to distinguish the number 0 versus the letter O in PCS. Of course, your fonts sometimes will be a little different, but not only are we working with accuracy, but we have to think about our speed too. And if it just makes us go faster to our brains to separate an O and a 0. When we look at the PCS tables, so we have our index, but when we look at the tables, which would be where in your ICD-10 manual would be the tabular, they're divided up into 17 sections. Now, you don't have to have these sections memorized, okay, because it's all spelled out for you. But you do need to know that that first character is going to let you know what category you're in. Are you going to be coding in obstetrics, a procedure for obstetrics, or are you going to be in med surg, right? There's psych and behavioral health has its own. You can see these in the manual. Next, you've got section 1 through 9, which are med surg codes. O is probably your biggest first character, and then it's divided up into med surg 1 through 9, and then next you'll have ancillary, which would be B through D or F through H. Now there's 4 columns in each one of these tables, and each one of those columns will have drop down that is only pertinent to the previous character. Okay, so if it's not applicable, if you don't see what you need, the information in that first column, you're in the wrong place. If you get to the second column and you don't see the word you need, then you're in the wrong place. You go back to 1. Okay, the columns are based on what you see at the top. Okay, that gives you your identifier, and then a list. And you can open up your manual and you can see this, right? So if you you pick your first column, and then you pick your pertinent information, and then you go to, it'll give you a character, and that character you write down. Then you go to the next column, and then you look and see which one in that is applicable for the next placement, and then you pick it, and then you write that character down, and then you just keep doing this. So it's like a drop down that you get to pick from. So easy to use. Now, our first character, I already told you that med surg is the largest, but here's the others. I think there's like 16 or 17 here. So we have obstetrics, which is a 1. So every time that you do a procedure in obstetrics, the first character will always be a 1. If we're going to place something, the procedure is to place something, then it's going to be a 2. And it's not in med surg. This is strictly placement. If we do administration of something, it'll be a 3. If we're going to measure or monitor, that'll be a 4. Now, when I say measure, monitor, we have to think about that. What are we going to do? We're going to monitor the person's EKG tracings, right? We're going to monitor them overnight with a CPAP machine, right? Those are procedures that we can do to a patient. 5, extracorporeal or synthetic assistance in performance, things like the synthetic assistance, something that we're using. This is not measurement and monitoring. We're assisting the patient. Maybe we've got them on the ventilator, right? That's not monitoring. It's not measuring. We're assisting the person in breathing. Osteopathic, which 7, osteopathic is kind of self-explanatory. If there's other procedures that aren't listed anywhere else, they're going to be an 8. We do have chiropractic procedures that we can do on people. Imaging, so if we take a chest x-ray, if we do interventional radiology, would be under a B for imaging. Nuclear medicine, right? This is where we're going to be doing things like MRIs, right? CTs, I think, are all under nuclear medicine. Hold on, let me think for a second. I may be getting that confused with imaging. Radiation therapy. So a person is having, they're in oncology, they're a cancer patient, and they're having radiation treatments. It'll start with a D. If we're doing rehab, not only physical rehab, but they clumped in diagnostic audiology and F with physical rehab. Why they did that is because I believe those are two very small sections. Now, we don't use an I or an O. We could actually expand and divide these up later, but they're just so small that they don't need their own first character. Most likely, could that change someday? Yes, it absolutely could, because it's expandable. Mental health, so that's behavioral treatments. Anything with mental health is G. H, substance abuse. The treatments for substance abuse. Now, substance abuse treatment and mental health can be very similar to each other. And then X gives us the ability to use new technology. And that's really exciting. We weren't able to do that with ICD-9 Volume 3. But notice, we're not using all of the possibilities, the characters that we possibly could have. So new technology allows us to expand. We're going to talk about robotic procedures, having surgeries done by robotic arms, and that would be classified as new technology. The root operation, though, is really the basis. So what is the total division up, all these tables is made up of? Well, we need our first three characters, and let's say we're doing med-surg, because that's the largest, and we know that that's an O. So our first, and all of those on the previous slide that we looked at, those are all our first character. Okay, so we've got to pick where that's at. We're picking med-surg because, again, it's the largest. Then we need to know what body system we're working on. So let's say we are going to do lower extremities. Okay, so then you'd pick lower extremities. Root operation, we're going to amputate the leg below the knee, a BKA, below the knee amputation. So the root operation is a removal, right? So now we have O, whatever the second placement would be whatever lower extremities is, because that's the body system, the body, or maybe musculoskeletal. I'm sorry, let's say it would be musculoskeletal. Root operation, we're going to remove something, so we know we're amputating. What body part? Lower extremity, and then it will break it down to right or left, and also may even break it down to lower extremity to where the amputation is going to occur. What approach are we going to use? Now, approach for an amputation isn't going to be as defined as if we were doing an appendectomy, because then we want to know approach, is it laparoscopic or is it open, right? So that's what approach means. Device, is there any special device being used, right? And that would be the sixth character. And then the seventh character would be qualifier. Is there any special tracking that we need to do with this particular code? So there's your 7 characters. And if we don't have the 6th and 7th character are not definable, we would just place an X, because we know X is our, placement holder. There's nothing that goes there. That root operation is the 3rd character. You do need to memorize that the root operation is the 3rd character. You really need to memorize also all of these: section, body part, root operation, body system, body part, approach, et cetera, et cetera. You need to know those. Okay. The root operation is really telling the story. Okay. Med-surg is what we're dealing with. What body system are we working on? Well, we're in the respiratory system. Then the root operation is, what's the procedure we're actually going to do? Are we, if it's cardiovascular, are we going to implant something? Are we going to put a valve in? Are we going to do a bypass? Are we placing a stent? Are we putting in a pacemaker? You know, all of that is identified by the root operation. And if you don't get the root operation right, then you're not going to be able to find the correct verbiage, standard verbiage for the rest of the code. Then you need to know that there are no combination codes in PCS, not like we have in ICD-10 or even in CPT. Every code stands alone. So sometimes you'll have to do a code more than once, you know, but it'll be right and left, right? We'll talk about that as well. So those root operations, if we are going to remove something from the body, and it's the little tiny words that will catch you with this. Okay, so the root operation that removes some or all of a body part. Okay, some or all of a body part. That's very pertinent. Those terms would be destruction, detachment, excision, extraction, or resection. So if I'm going to take out the appendix, okay, the appendix is part of you've got your stomach as the gastric system, and it is it hangs off of the large intestine. So are we going to destroy it? Are we going to detach it? Are we going to excise it, which like cutting? Are we going to extract it? Are we going to resect it? And you think, oh my word, all 5 of those are applicable, right? Well, no, they actually mean something completely different. Every single one of those terms is removing something or all of a body part, but they have a specific definition. So a destruction is not a detachment. A detachment is not an excision. An excision is not an extraction. A resection is not a destruction. Okay, they have a definition, and that's the key. Once you learn those, again, you're golden. Now, remember I told you that if we were removing something, that's what an amputation is. Okay, which one of these words is for amputations only? Which one do you think is it a destruction? Is it a detachment? Is it an excision? Is it an extraction or resection? Okay, we do not excise the lower extremity when we do an amputation. We don't extract it. We don't do a resection. We actually detach it. Okay, so we would not detach the appendix, even though that's physically kind of what you're doing. You're cutting it off. No, a detachment is only amputations. Only. So it's a removal, like I said, but it is a detachment. The thing about PCS that's different than CPT. CPT has been around for a long time, and your providers and your clinicians know, for the most part, the verbiage that, you know, they're not taught how to code, but the verbiage follows documentation guidelines and rules, kind of, you know, for the most part. CPT. PCS does not. Okay, they have a standard. It's not unique, it's just standard. That's why we know a detachment is only an amputation. Now, is the provider going to put in the documentation that he is detaching the right leg below the knee? No, he's going to say he's amputating. And we have to know that an amputation is a detachment. It's not the provider's job to say that it's a detachment. It's our job to know that a detachment in PCS is an amputation and an amputation alone. Okay, so your skills are a true liaison and translator. They don't, PCS is very new to them, and so they are not going to use this verbiage. Now, in my humble opinion, I think PCS will eventually take over CPT because it's expandable, it's much more user-friendly, and it's more exact. So, don't know when it'll happen, but I think it'll happen eventually. Plus, it is public, it's not owned by the AMA. And so anybody can write, not everybody can, you can only get the CPT manual by AMA. Nobody else can publish it. Whereas with PCS, anybody can. It's just like ICD-10-CM. No competition there. If we're going to remove a solid, fluid, or gases from the body, there's 3 root operation terms: drainage, extirpation, and fragmentation. So if we're going to remove a solid, we're not going to drain it, but we might fragment it. What would be something we would fragment? We're think we're breaking off. So if it's a solid, fluid, or gas, and we're going to remove it from the body, drainage, extirpation, and fragmentation. Now, drainage is pretty easy, right? But you don't drain gas. Root operation that involves cutting or separation is a division or a release. So if a person has carpal tunnel syndrome and they go in and do a procedure to release that tendon, it's a release. They cut it and release it. What are they doing? They're cutting it or they're separating it. So that's a division or a release. You're probably writing like mad to get all of this, but this information that I'm telling you is in your manual. Okay, so you just need to make sure you note it. You can write it for study purposes, but it's there. How about if we want to put something back or remove something, or move some or all of a body part, right? Think of a flap. So we're going to put something in the body. We're going to put something that will back in the body that was there before, or we're going to move some or all of a body part. Have you heard of them taking the great toe, the big toe, and when a person's had an amputation of a thumb and attaching it to the hand so that they have a thumb again? That's moving all of a body part, a thumb, right? So those root operations would fall under reattachment, reposition, transfer, or transplantation. So if we're going to put a kidney into a body, we're transplanting it. We're transplantation. If we're going to do a flap procedure on skin, that's going to be a reposition or transfer. Root operations that alter, so they're changing the diameter, how wide or narrow it is, a route of a tubular body. So that's a bypass, dilation, occlusion, or restriction. If you have gastric bypass, you're changing the after the esophagus from the stomach, and then you go into the let's see, the pyloric sphincter, and you're cutting that off and you're reattaching part of that small intestine. They go like this, pull it out, and then they reattach it, so you have malabsorption. You're not using as much malabsorption, not malabsorption. You're not using as much of your intestine. Okay? So we're bypassing it. What if you are clenching down the stomach and you put the gastric ring on there? Are we restricting it? Right. If we're completely occluding a vessel, that's an occlusion. If we're opening up or dilating a vessel, so if you go in and have a cardiac cath and they dilate those vessels to let the blood through, dilation. If you bypass vessels in the heart, it's a bypass. If we are going to do a root operation that involves a device, some type of a device that's being put in, we're going to use change, insertion, replacement, removal, revision, or supplement. Okay. Are we replacing a part of the heart? Right. Are we putting in a valve in the heart? Then if we're just doing an exam, then it's going to be under inspection or map. Okay. Now it's going to take you some time to get the feel for these, but if you divide them up in these categories, that'll help you. If we're going to repair something, then we're going to either use the root operation control or repair. So if we're going to control the bleeding, right? If we're going to do a root operation that includes some other objective that's not already covered, we can alter something, we can create, or we can fuse something together. We can fuse a joint. We can create another avenue for blood to go through or something. And then when you get all of these together and you look them up and you've got them divided up, the ultimate thing is you're not ever, the first two characters are super easy to find. But this third root operation is going to be the hardest of all the characters to determine until you get that learning, get through that learning curve of, you know, saying, okay, are we doing a repair? Are we doing a removal? What are we doing? Once you get that, everything falls into place. I keep saying that, but it's vital that you get the root operation correct. And one of the ways you can tell you didn't get the root operation is that the root operation is the third character, but after that, your fourth character it won't be applicable. Okay, it won't be there. And that's going to be your body part. So you say, okay, I'm going to do a repair. But then you go and you look at the repair under that body system. So we got the body system, and then you're going to do a repair, but it's not in there. What body part? Then that means you didn't get the right root operation, or you didn't get the right, you know, you probably got the right body system. So off the top of my head, if I'm going to do a repair and I picked the respiratory system, and I need to do a repair of the alveoli of the left lung. That's what I think it is. It's a repair. But there is no alveoli as in the body part. That means I can't do a repair to it isn't done. We don't do a repair to the alveoli because we can't repair the alveoli. So we have to back up. So, okay, well, it's not a repair. What is it? Are we creating something? Are we altering something? Maybe, you know, find a different root operation. And then when you get to the right root operation, then you'll see, oh, alveoli's there, right? So again, that's your heads up that you're in the wrong area. Back up and punt again. Body part is the fourth character. So simple, because what's the body part that you're working on? Are you working on the lung? Are you working on the brain? Are you working on the heart? Are you working on one of the vessels in the body? Are you working in the lymphatic system, the musculoskeletal system? You know, are we looking at the eyes, ears, nose, mouth? You know, it just really is easy to get the body part. If the body part isn't there, then you've got the wrong root operation. We don't do that procedure on that body part. And then your fifth character is the approach. So how are we getting there? Are we going to do it laparoscopically? Are we going to do it open? You know, and pretty much that's your two, you know, percutaneous. You only got about 4 choices usually in the fifth characters. There's a little more depending on what you're doing to the body. If you can only go with an open approach, then that's all there is. That's the only choice that you'll be given. So it's so simple. Some things that you do need to be aware of, though, that I wanted to highlight. If you come into documentation that when you look at the documentation and you see that there's separate body part values, but you don't have a code for that, and you don't feel like you're getting to a specific, you can't get to a higher specificity, what do we do? So what if you have a word like peri, which just means around, right? There's multiple body part that could be, you know, with the word peri. Then you code to the body part's name. Thinking of the pericardium, well, then you code to the heart. If you, let's see, the perineum, it's all around, code to the body part. If there isn't a, if it like branches off, then you'd go to the closest branch. So if you're doing something vascularly and it's always branching off, go to the closest branch. Let's say you're doing an identical procedure bilaterally. How do you code that in PCS? Well, if it states that it has a bilateral value, then you just have to do the code once, because it'll state, you know, that, okay, we're doing it both sides. But if there isn't a bilateral option, then you have to code each separately. So off the top of my head, I couldn't think of one. So let's just pick something like, we're going to replace the knee. We don't normally replace the knee on the same day, but let's say we do this time for whatever reason. Since we don't replace the knee bilaterally, there's probably not a distinction. It'll just say right or left. So we have to write it twice. We have to use the code twice. Right? But always know, remember that I said you need to know the operative approach. This plays a big part in getting to that higher specificity with the approach, open or closed, percutaneous. You know, like I said, there's about 4 or 5 values. Remember that. Our approaches are, like I said, there's four main ones. So we've got open, we've got percutaneous, then you have percutaneous endoscopic, and then look down at external. Now, that's your 4 main ones, but every once in a while, you're going to have via natural or artificial opening, via natural artificial opening endoscopic, or via natural artificial opening with percutaneous endoscopic assistance. Now, that's all going to be spelled out for you in the documentation, but what would we do through an artificial opening? What kind of approach could be done through an artificial opening? I think of if we need to go in and scope somebody and they have a stoma, we may go in through the stoma to look, right? Especially if it's right there that we need to visualize. And that would be via natural or artificial opening endoscopic. Robotic assistance, we definitely use that with new technology now. It is something that's being used more and more. That is going to be a special table for 8E0. Remember, 8 is the first area that we're going to be in. So we're going to go to 8, then it'll be E, and then it'll be third character will always be an O. So if you are using an open approach with percutaneous assistance, endoscopic assistants are coded to open approach. Then if you do external approach, and it includes procedures performed within an orifice or a structure that's visible, and then you could do procedures that are performed percutaneously via a device placed for the procedure coded to percutaneous approach. So this is just better explaining the previous slide. But with the robotic assistance, you are going to have always know there will be an additional code is assigned whenever you use this robotic technology, because it's new. So you're going to use that 8 code. The device. Some people get confused with the device. That's always the 6th character. But what they're wanting to identify is, what are you putting in the body? Okay, what device is being used? Are we putting in a pacemaker? Then we need to identify what it is. It's a pacemaker. So here's our choices. Is it biological or synthetic? Is it therapeutic material, or is it mechanical or electrical, electronic appliance? So let's look at the first one. So we decide that it's a biological material and it's going to take place of all or a portion of a body part. So if we replace the heart, that's a biological, right? We're going to put in another heart, not a synthetic heart, but another heart. Is it going to take the place of all or a portion of the body part? It's taking the place of all of it. So that's going to give us one character. Maybe it's going to just assist or prevent a physiological function. That would be a pacemaker. It's synthetic. If it's a therapeutic material, it's not going to be absorbed into the body, because there's therapeutic materials that would be like certain stitches and stuff. It's going to be eliminated by or incorporated into the body part, a therapeutic material. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. I have these on another presentation that for a couple conferences on teaching PCS. Off the top of my head, I can't think of one. So if you think of a therapeutic material that's not absorbed by, eliminated by, or incorporated into the body part, what would that be? With burns, you have therapeutic material that's placed to allow the skin to grow underneath and protect the skin. That would be not absorbed. If we have mechanical or electrical appliance that's going to assist, monitor, or take the place of or prevent a physiological function. Now, this is going to be actually your pacemaker, not your biological or synthetic material. So that second bullet wouldn't be a pacemaker, like I said before. It would actually be this fourth one, because that is a mechanical and or electronical. It's going to assist the heart to maintain its rhythm. It's also monitors. If you didn't know that, a pacemaker will monitor, and it's going to help that maintain a rhythm. Materials, pay attention to them. Are we using clips, ligatures, or sutures? That's not considered a device. So when we stitch a person up and that body, the stitches stay under the skin, they dissolve and they're absorbed by the body, that's not a device. Or if we go in and we do a tubal ligation for sterilization of the fallopian tubes and we leave clips in to ligate that, that's not considered a device. When you think of devices, though, you're going to want to get to the highest specificity as you can. So think of devices that are used for specific issues or procedures in the body. That'll help you when you're trying to pick the right code. If no device is used, then you just put a Z in that placement. Z's are like X's. They're just placeholders. It means it's not applicable. If you don't know what devices could be used, there is a key in your manual that's a device key, and there is a device aggregation table that you can use that will list different devices. So take some time to look at that, because again, I've said it before, you don't know it exists if you haven't seen it, right? So pay attention to that in your manual. Qualifiers, that seventh character. Now, if it's not applicable, if we don't have a qualifier, then you're just, again, going to put a Z there because that's your placement. But it is just giving us more information that says that this procedure is unique. Okay, and that this procedure is unique and individual to a procedure that's being done. It identifies it as different, and we need to collect that for statistical purposes. Just disregard this lesson 6.2. I meant to take that off. If you get the right PCS code and you follow all the directions and you go step by step, the guidelines will lead you. You don't have to have this stuff memorized. So let's talk about the different conventions that we need to know. And this is how we set the manual set up. So we know we have a possibility of 7 characters. We know those last 2 characters may or may not be applicable to our procedure. And if they're not, we just replace them with a Z. right? Each character is multi-axial, so if we don't get the right root operation, then if that root operation cannot be done to that body part, then that body part will not be listed. Each one of your codes, each one of your characters is, all the following characters is dependent on that code. So that's like saying, okay, I'm going to do a removal of the respiratory system. So we got med surges and O, then we got the respiratory system, whatever character it is. Let's say it's a B, I don't know. And then our root operation, we are not doing a detachment. Let's say we're excising, and I'm just getting this off my head, so don't mark me as that this is what it is. Say we need to remove the left lower lobe of the lung. Okay, we're not taking out the entire lung, we're taking just the lower lobe, which means that it changes on the list of what removals. So if we pick the wrong root operation, then that means we pick the wrong block. When you pick up that block, that little wooden block, and you look at your options, there's an A, a red A here, and then you flip it over, there's a blue number 1, and there's a little kite over here, and then the next little side of the block. You know how it had different things? If you pick the wrong block, then you're not going to be, it may not have what you want. If you want to get a kite, if you pick the wrong block, it's not going to have a kite on it. If you pick the wrong root operation, then you can't remove part of the lung because it won't be listed in there. Even though you picked the right respiratory system, the second character, the third character, again, if you don't pick the right one, it won't be listed. So that tells you to go back. It's multi-axial. There's 34 possible values. We do know that we can add to those values anytime we need to. It's so expandable in PCS. CPT is extremely limited. The meaning of the single value can have more than one meaning, but it's definitely going to have a, its definition is very clear. It'll say all, or in part, or it'll just say in part. If you remove an entire organ, it may not be this particular root operation, because this is defined as removing just a portion, or it's only procedures done on luminal body parts, which means it has to be tube-like. Let's see, over time, we can still expand, and the meanings may change just a little bit, but the index is going to get you to the proper table. That's clear. With PCS, you're always going to be using the tables, but you could go just to the tables and not use the index. Because you learn the tables and you can go look them up because you know, right? So I'm going to look under excisions. I'm going to go to med surge. So you open up that table to med surge, and then you can, it'll give you a list and say, okay, now I'm going to the respiratory system. So that is here. So I'm going to open up the turn pages to that. And then I'm going to get my root operation, which is going to give you a list. And then again, you don't have to use the index with PCS. Whereas with CPT and ICD and with HCPCS, you got to use the index. You look at the index and then you use it to get you where you need to be in the tabular, and you don't code off the tabular, but you can code off of the table alone. You don't have to use the index. We already talked about how the codes, the individual characters have to be valid. And if they're not valid, they won't give you the option you need. So some of the verbiage, you're not getting the verbiage right, in other words. If you have combination of choices on characters 4 through 7, you might have options in the same row, okay? But that means that you're going to do the code twice then. If it says and, means and or, that's kind of given now with all of our code sets. But remember, it's your responsibility to get the proper root operation, because the verbiage in the documentation is we use a standard and your providers are not going to use a standard to PCS, although it's very narrow focus. So it's going to be easy to get the proper one. The best way to learn how to use PCS is to practice. And there's some really good practice in your text, but go out there. And I would say one of the leading places to do research, expand your knowledge on PCS, is to go look at the AHIMA websites. They have some great articles on how to code specific procedures, and I would take some time to invest in looking at AHIMA. If you find anything particularly interesting that you want to share with everybody, do so in the club or the student course forum. There are even examples in the PCS guidelines, exercises, so that's kind of nice to help you along. Body system, very, very important, because it gives us that anatomical region that if we're not in the right body system, we're not going to get the root operation. But for the most part, I think you're not going to have any trouble with body systems. It just makes sense to us if we know our anatomy and terminology. If you don't know that, then you need to pick up anatomy and terminology course, and CCO offers that for you. Be very careful about information on upper and lower body parts. The dividing line is the diaphragm in PCS. So everything above the diaphragm is upper and everything below the diaphragm is lower. Root operations is going to be the basis for every procedure that's done, whether it be a obstetric procedure or it be in mental health. So we don't do a resection in mental health, do we? But we do evaluations and monitoring. So there won't be as many root operations in mental health or in chiropractic than there is in med-surg. Multi-procedures are coded if, again, you do the root operation and then you have multiple choices in that next column. The same root operation can be repeated on different body parts. When you're doing multiple procedures, the root operation is distinct, but you may have to repeat a code something twice because of a pivotal area, because of body part. But if it's in the same body part, then you'd only have to use it one. You can use the root operation and the approach and everything. But what happens if you do something in one body, you do the same root operation, but in one body part you're open and in the other body part you're endoscopic? That can be done too. Just more information about root operations to clarify them for you. The procedure, if you go in and you do a procedure but it's discontinued, then you go ahead and code it out like you did the procedure. It doesn't work with modifiers like CPT. You go ahead and code it out. If it's discontinued before the any other root operation is performed, then you code the root operation inspection, because you get reimbursed for going in and looking. Okay. What about biopsies? Well, with biopsies, you're going to be using root operations of excision, extraction. You could do drainage, but you might be using a qualifier. And the qualifier would say, hey, we went and did this via the purpose of doing a diagnostic test. So that qualifier character would say diagnostic. You know, those last two characters I told you need to be aware of, and sometimes you put a Z in there. If you do a diagnostic biopsy and then you do on the same site a biopsy and another treatment. So let's say we do a biopsy, but we also remove the mass that we found. okay? Then you are going to code for the more definitive treatment, right? So you don't have to do the biopsy as well as the amputation. You do the amputation. If you're going to do an excision repair or an inspection and it overlaps different layers, say in the musculoskeletal system, then what you need to do is make sure that you specify the deepest layer, right? So we're going to go in and we're going to debride and look at this ulcer, then you're going to code to the deepest layer. And that is pretty standard. You do that in CPT as well. So that's easily understood. When you do root operations and the body part is going to be bypassed from one body part to another one, then you're going to use a qualifier, one of those last two characters. Sometimes with coronary arteries, you're going to have to number them. The arteries are distinct arteries that are being treated. So you could see multiple codes being repeated because of that. Whenever you do bypasses, the qualifier will also be in there because they want to know what vessel was bypassed to and what vessel it was bypassed from. If you're going to do multiple bypasses, then you do a separate procedure for each coronary artery that was done, and then it will have a different qualifier. So the first part of your code will all look the same, but you're going to have a different device or qualifier on each one. So you get to list it more than once. So easy to use. Excuse me. What happens if you stop or you attempt to stop a procedure post-procedural or other, say like bleeding? Well, if that happens and it's unsuccessful, then you're going to have to go to the root operation, such as like they're giving you a list of bypass, detachment, excision, extraction, and reposition, replacement, or resection. Then that root operation is coded instead of control. So again, pay attention to when we're controlling something like acute bleeding. If we're going to resect a specific body part, then we need to know if all of the body part was cut out or cut off. That's going to be specified, determining if it's an amputation versus a removal, et cetera, excision, resection, things like that. Sometimes separate procedure is coded with an autograft and obtained from a different body part, right? That happens on skin transfers. So separate procedure. You're going to do a PCS code for grafting the skin from, the hip and then putting it on the neck, right? So it's two codes. That's the way CPT works too. Let's see. This was a lot of information I wanted to put on one slide, so forgive me for making it a little bit smaller, but these are just things you need to be heads up for, right? Be aware. So if we're doing spinal vertebral joint and we're fusing it and making it immobile, then we'll use a spinal fusion, but we need to know the level of the spine that the fusion went to. Got to know your anatomy. Got to know your anatomy to be able to do that. If you fuse multiple joints, then you're going to use your PCS code for each joint, and then you're going to do a different device or qualifier, those last two characters. Maybe we're going to do an interbody fusion device, so we're placing in rods or something like that. Then there is actually an area for an intrabody fusion device, last two characters. Internal fixation, if it's going to be an interbody fusion and it's not used, then it's still going to be coded with that internal fixation device, not interbody fusion device. If we do a bone graft and you do a bone graft is the only device that's used, then you're going to use non-autologous tissue substitute value. So you have to understand what an autologous is and the tissue substitute, and we use these bone grafts in the spine a lot. If you do a mixture of auto and non-autologous grafts, bone grafts, then you code with the autologous. So that's like a default. So if you're going to use both, and they do that when they fuse, when they work on the spine and they're going to build up with a cage, the vertebra, they may use the autologous, the bone from your own body, and then non-autologous to do that. You just go ahead and default to the one code autologous, but you may use it more than once because you're fusing you're building up different parts of the spine. Let's see, if we're doing an inspection, then you have to think to yourself, what's the objective of the procedure? And then you wouldn't code it separately if that inspection is part of the body. If you have to do a body part and you're doing an inspection and you have to do it to achieve the outcome of the procedure, then you don't have to code that separately. Maybe multiple tubular parts, then you code for the farthest away from the midline. So that's distal instead of proximal. Got to know your medical terminology and anatomy, right? So if it's a tubular body part, meaning it's hollow, you'd code out to the farthest away from the midline, farthest away from the body. Maybe we're doing multiple non-tubular body parts being inspected, then you code the body part that specifies the entire area. This is non-tubular. This isn't tube. This would be solid. Okay. If we do an inspection and we're doing at the same time other procedures, but it's all happening on the same body part during the same event, then the inspection, you get to code it separately if it's performed using a different approach. So if you go in laparoscopically, right, and you are doing, you're going to do the procedure laparoscopic, but you end up doing an open approach and looking around, then the inspection's done with the open approach. Because think about that when you're doing a procedure. Why else would you open them up? You can't get to, you need to do a better inspection. I know that when I had my gallbladder out, he told me that, of course, he says, I always try to do laparoscopic, but he says, every once in a while, I'll run into a situation where I need to go ahead and open you up and your recovery time's a little bit longer. But he said, I try not to do that. And then, and he goes, and I usually don't have to, but mine was acute. And it was, I didn't have stones or anything, he said, but it was so slimy and starting to degrade already that he said, it took me like 4 times to be able to get it wrapped up in bags to pull it out. He said that he goes, I went ahead and tried it one more time to be able to get it out, or I was going to open you up. And he said, and I got it. So that would be, a reason. Embolizations. Now, you need to know what an embolization is, but an embolization is where we're blocking something off. So if you're going to completely close a vessel, then you code as an occlusion, but it has to be completely closed off. An embolization, I had an embolization done to the vessels to my uterus. It's called a uterine embolization because of a giant fibroid that I had. Now, was it a complete embolization? Some of it was, but some of it wasn't. But it really restricts the blood flow, and therefore the fibroid gets smaller. Now, if it just narrows the lumen, the vessels, then it's a restriction. So you have to know the difference between is it an occlusion or a restriction? An occlusion always means we clamp it down, nothing gets through. A restriction is we're slowing it down, we're making it smaller. Release is going to be something that's freed and not the tissue being manipulated or cut free, right? So what are we releasing? We're releasing the carpal tunnel, right? That tendon ligament. If we're going to free something without cutting it, then it's a release. If we separate it or transect a body part, that's classified as a division. What you need to do to help, ooh, dear, I went that too fast. I accidentally bumped it. What will help you is to go to these tables and see what your options are for that light reading. If we do an, let's see, embolization, we already did that. Okay, I think I must have. Reduction of a displaced fracture. So we have a fracture, it's displaced. It's not in the right place. This fracture, we just cut it in half. But if it's displaced, then the root operation is a reposition. But what happens if we do a cast or we put a splint? Then the reposition's not coded. You just do the cast. If we do a non-displaced fracture, then it's coded to the procedure performed, which would be like we're casting or splinting. If you're going to put a living body part from another individual, then it's a transplantation. Okay, we're taking a kidney out of this person and we're putting it into another person. If you're doing a non-autologous cells, then it's administration. We're administering stem cells, but the stem cells didn't come from you. If we're taking stem cells from you, we're going to do something to them and then we're going to put them back in your body. That's in immunotherapy happens with cancer patients. That's a transplant. If we do procedures on that don't have separate body parts, then you do the coding corresponding to the whole body part. So let's say we don't have, for example, what we do, but let's say the lung. We don't have one for taking out just the lower lobe of the lung. We have to do the whole lung, okay, whether we take the whole lung or not. That isn't a scenario because there is a code for it, but let's say there wasn't, then we would. Peri, we already talked about Peri. Procedures that are continuous suction of a tubular body part, then we're going to use the body part that's the farthest from the anatomical site from the point of entry. Now, what type of a procedure would be a continuous suction? That would be if a person has a wound and we put a wound vac on them, continuous suction. But if it's of a tubular body part, like we're going to do something in through the throat or the lungs, that would be, or somebody has they put in a suction or a drainage device and they hook it up because they did a procedure in your abdomen. Okay, then it's the farthest point. Bilateral body parts, you'll have codes for that when it's relevant. Coronary arteries, they are classified as a single body part, but you have to go to the smallest point, okay, for the number of arteries treated. Then tendons, ligaments, bursa, and fascia. If you don't know what bursa and fascia are, you need to look those up. Do your med term. You code them in the respective body system. Okay, so if we're doing the carpal tunnel, then you would need to be in that body system that you're working on. How about performed on joint structures? Then it's going to be the joint body system. Whenever we deal with skin, some things you need to be aware of with skin, subcutaneous tissue, and fascia that are surrounding the joint, that gets coded a little bit different. So if this is kind of like a little key that you need. If it's going to be of the shoulder, then it's the upper arm. If it's the elbow, it's the lower arm. Okay, so elbow, where does it go? It goes to the lower arm. If it's the wrist, it goes to the lower arm. Okay, that's easy enough. So only the shoulder is upper arm. The elbow and wrist is lower arm. Hip is upper leg. Knee is lower leg, right? But ankle is coded to the foot. Now this right here, you need to jot down and you need to make a note of it for you. Now, this information is actually in your manual, but it's difficult to find. So you might want to pause the video and make yourself a note of this or come back to this so that you know that whenever we do anything to a joint that has to do with the subcutaneous tissue, the skin or the fascia, and you will do stuff to that. Shoulder is upper arm, elbow and wrist is lower arm, hip is upper leg, knee is lower leg, but the ankle goes to the foot. You don't separate fingers and toes. They just go to the foot or the hand. That's nice to know. Your phalanges are part of your foot or your hand. The approach, we did discuss this a little bit. We have our open approaches, but if you have open approach with percutaneous endoscopic assistance, then it's coded as open. If you do external, but you do something in the orifice or on structures visible without the aid of an instrument, then it's considered external. That's your key. Okay, you don't have to use a device to look. If you do something directly by application of an external force through layers, it's external. So if I'm going to zap your kidney stones with lithotripsy, that's external. If we're going to do something percutaneous via device, then it's still coded as percutaneous. And these are the little things that kind of trip you up as you go along, but you get better at it. There is no, there's no gray areas with PCS. It either is or it isn't. That's another reason why PCS is so much better than CPT. CPT has, oh, well, I guess that would be included in this. No, they spell everything out for you in PCS. It either is or it isn't. And if this comes up, then you do it this way. With the device also, let's see, if you have anything remaining in the body after the procedure, then your root operation could be temporary or intraoperative device, and you need to identify that in a qualifier because something's staying in the body. Whenever anything stays in the body, you're going to be using that qualifier. If you remove that device, then it's classified as a removal. Right. So now we got materials, sutures, ligatures, and everything. We know that's not coded. We already discussed that. That device is not mentioned. But let's say we have a device only and not a body part. Well, then the root operation changes. Then we use irrigation, removal, or revision. If we're going to separate a procedure to put in a, we're going to use a separate procedure to put in a drainage device. Now, this happens commonly when you do major surgeries. So if you have a mastectomy, they're going to put in a drainage device. Any way that you traumatize the body, even if you're doing it for a good reason, that you got to get rid of all the fluid the body builds up to protect itself from the trauma. So mastectomies will have a drainage tube. You'll have a drainage tube whenever you do any type of major abdominal surgery. Some plastic surgeries will even have a drainage device. Obstetrics, just like with ICD and CPT, obstetrics has its own little world. So note that if you have any, if any part of the baby is considered a product of conception at all times, okay, it's always referred to as a product of conception, and it's always in the obstetric section. If you have your mother, it's coded to the root operation of med-surg. Okay, if you're doing something on a pregnant female, then it's going to be coded in med-surg, not obstetric. So that's different. It's not what we're used to. If you're going to do procedures after a delivery or an abortion, and that they're talking about spontaneous abortion, miscarriage, or not a spontaneous abortion, that is still all coded in the obstetric section. All right. So if your your patient comes in and she's pregnant and she has a laceration on her foot, it's coded out of med-surg. Right? If she is having spontaneous bleeding and cramping and she's admitted for monitoring, that's an obstetrics. If anything is happening to the baby itself, the fetus at any stage, it is coded to obstetrics. The procedures are done on obstetrics, whether it's monitoring or not. The examples for obstetrics, the curature, curage, and evacuation, the root operation would be extraction and body part products of conception retained. Okay. If a D&C is done postpartum, then it's going to be med-surg, root operation extraction, and body part is endometrium because the mother is not pregnant anymore. So it's not obstetrics. And that's it. A lot of information. I know we went through a lot, but it's intense in the beginning. But since there's no gray area, it's either is or is not, you're going to find that PCS is amazing and fun to work with. But that learning curve of getting those root operations and those simple little guidelines in, once you get it, you know, you're golden. You're going to appreciate the simplicity and the specificity that you can get with PCS. And that's another reason I bet once you are more familiar with it, you will say, oh yeah, I can see how this is someday going to replace CPT, or I hope it does. All right, that's great. Don't forget your questions that you can answer in the Student Support Hub, or any interesting information that you find that you want to share with us. This would be a great opportunity to do it because, again, there's learning curve. Go out to a HEMA. If you find something helpful in PCS there, share it with everybody. You can share it in the club, or you can share it in the student forum. If you're joining, if you haven't already joined YouTube and Facebook, don't forget to like and subscribe because you can share with everybody else, right? So that would be good to let them know how much we love PCS and if they want to learn more. Oh, we got some questions. Let's see. Do hospitals recognize the CIC? I never see it as required. I only see RHIT, RHIA for inpatient, and you might see CCS. The reason you don't see the CIC listed is because it is a newer credential, and quite honestly, it's an inpatient credential. But when your coding department in the hospital says, hey, we got approval to hire another coder, they call HR and they use that same ad that they've been using for the last 20 years, you know, the criteria of what they're looking at, the marketing and stuff. So absolutely, it's recognized by hospitals. And CCS prep course, yes, we do have. We do. And we also are getting ready to launch our pharmacology course, which is needed for the CCS. They do test you more in depth than the CIC and pharmacology and some other things. And you can find out more about that on our YouTube channel because we did videos on it. All right. Thanks for your question, guys. Great questions that you can go ask also in our CCO club. Bye-bye.